So I want to talk about leadership this morning, about leadership. And so I thought I'd start off with a story by one of our greatest leaders, Abraham Lincoln, a story he liked to tell. It was, in fact, about a preacher who was talking about leadership and about perfection, about, that none of us is perfect, but we strive for that in our leadership. And the pastor started to do a riff on, of course, the only perfect person was Jesus, and kept talking about Jesus, the perfect. And one woman in the congregation actually stood up and she said, "Pastor, there was one other person who was perfect, one other person. It was a woman, in fact." And the preacher, of course, was kind of surprised by this, said, "Well, who was this?" And the woman said, "I've been hearing about this woman and how perfect she was every day for years now. It was my husband's first wife. She was perfect. She was perfect." Only Jesus was perfect. Only Jesus was a perfect leader. But I kind of worry about leadership. I see so much poor leadership in our world. I worry that the kids of today, as they're growing up and they're seeing the different leaders around us, that they're getting so many examples of bad leadership. I'm probably going to put my foot in it this morning. I said this at the first service, and I had a couple people who were frustrated. I think we have a president who shows poor leadership. One lady, kind of said, "Well, I don't want you talking about politics, Pastor. I'm just talking about leadership." And I don't think we're seeing that in our president. But lots of other places as well, too. The former mayor in Baltimore, I had heard at first that she had written that children's book about, healthy kids. And I was like, how cool, she's helping kids be healthier. And then turned out that was part of a fraud scam. Poor leadership. Maybe you were following in the news about the superintendent of Baltimore County Schools, who just finished a jail term for poor leadership, and then the one after that didn't seem all that good either. Poor leadership in our schools. We see poor leadership in businesses. I was reading this week that over 1,000 CEOs, major company CEOs, were either fired or resigned in companies just in 2019. There was the CEO of McDonald's who was fired for an inappropriate relationship, consensual relationship with a fellow employee. There was the CEO of Nissan that was fired on the same day he was arrested. Seems appropriate. The CEO of Under Armour, Justice Department had swooped in and he was fired. We see it in sports. Many of you know I'm a big cycling fan, and for years I was just amazed at Lance Armstrong coming back from cancer and winning the Tour de France multiple times, and now we find out, he was cheating all along. Just poor leadership. We see it sometimes in the church. There's a church pastor out in Chicago area named Bill Hybels that myself and lots of other leaders have just been really inspired by, and turns out he was doing stuff that was inappropriate. Just all this poor leadership. And of course, poor leadership is not a new occurrence. It's always been around. And this Advent season, I've been looking at Isaiah, who lived 700 years before the time of Jesus. And he had to deal with poor leadership as well. He had a number of kings who were kings during his time of being a prophet. And the first was Uzziah, who was actually a pretty decent king. It was right at the end of his life when Isaiah became a prophet. And Uzziah, at the end of his life, offended God. They said that's why he got leprosy. His son, Jotham, and there's a little chart for that kind of shows the kings of Isaiah, was a decent king, but he was a young man when he took office, and he just didn't have the experience, and he had some challenges. He was kind of a weak leader, I think because of his age and learning he needed to do. He was overtaken by the worst king that Isaiah was really frustrated with. His name was Ahaz, and Ahaz had no regard for God at all. Instead was very political in his dealings. And then finally, at the end of Isaiah's life, he got a really good king. His name was Hezekiah, and Hezekiah helped the people turn back to faith and an orientation toward God. But it was all throughout his ministry, Isaiah was talking about good leadership. And I want to read to you where he kind of dreams at what a great leader will be. He was kind of prophesying Jesus. He writes in Isaiah 11, "A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse." We've probably all seen like a tree stump, a tree cut down, and sometimes a new sprout will come out from that. And Isaiah dreams of a leader from Jesse who is the father of King David, the best king, the greatest king the Jews ever had. And so he's looking for somebody like him. A branch shall grow out of his roots. And this is what this leader will bring. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him. God's Spirit will guide this leader. A spirit of, and these words might sound familiar, of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and fear or respect or awe of the Lord. Those words should sound familiar. 2 weeks back, when Sawyer was baptized here, we spoke these words. And next Sunday, we'll have 3 more baptisms, and we'll speak these words. And what I often say to parents is, if you think about the hopes and the dreams that you have for your child, these are some of the things you might want for them. Wisdom and understanding, counsel and might, knowledge and respect of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord, Isaiah writes. He goes on to say, he shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear. He won't let himself be tricked, but with righteousness and a right relationship with God. He shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He's going to look out for those who are in need. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, a poetic way to say his words will have power. And with the breath of his lips, he shall kill the wicked. He's going to get rid of the wicked. Righteousness, again, being right with God, shall be the belt around his waist. It'll just keep everything together. And faithfulness, the belt around his loins. This is Isaiah's dream of a great leader. And then he starts to do a little riff, if you will. I talked last week about peace, and particularly about peace among nations. But all throughout Isaiah, he dreams of peace. And he does a little riff on not just peace among nations, but actually peace even in the animal kingdom. He writes, the wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid, the baby lamb. The calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together. How amazing. And the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. Is that a vision of peace, even with animals that are normally enemies? And then he wraps up this section in this way. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And again, this dream of a leader. On that day, the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples. The nations shall inquire of him, and his dwelling shall be glorious. What a great dream of leadership. And I thought in this season, as we're preparing and we're waiting for Jesus at Christmas, that I might talk a little bit about the leadership, particularly of Jesus, that we wait for. There's a really great book called Lead Like Jesus, where Phil Hodges and Ken Blanchard explore the qualities of Jesus and how we could lead more like Jesus. And they point out 4 qualities, especially about Jesus. They point out Jesus' heart. That Jesus had such a big heart, such a life of compassion that Jesus had. That the people who were shut out and broken and hurting in Jesus' day, those are the people that Jesus reached out to love. In particular, in the Christmas story, I love that in the Christmas story, it's shepherds. They are like the worst in their society. They are the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. It's shepherds who are invited at Jesus' birth, and it's wise men from another land, outsiders, non-Jews. Both of them are invited. What a great way to begin Jesus' ministry, that it's these outsiders, these shut out. Points us toward Jesus' heart. But also in Lead Like Jesus, they point out Jesus' head. Jesus was very smart, and even more than that, Jesus had a wonderful focus. Jesus knew where he was going, and he knew what God had for him to do. And we see even as the beginning of Jesus' life is starting, we see all these reminders of Jesus' purpose and focus. We hear the words of John the Baptist. We hear of not just once, not just twice, but 3 times angels come and point us toward who Jesus will be as they visit Mary and Joseph and the shepherds. Jesus' head and his focus were wonderful. And a reminder again, we're going to spend a little time thinking about mindfulness in the new year in 2020, kind of pointing our hearts and our heads in the right place, something to look forward in 2020. But Hodges and Blanchard also pointed out not just Jesus' head and his heart, but Jesus' hands. Jesus' hands. We've probably all heard that phrase, don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. Jesus, in the way that he lived out his faith, he reached out his hands to touch lepers and others who were in need of healing. Jesus reached out his hands to bless those who were hurting. And Jesus ultimately reached out his hands in the ultimate display of God's love for us all. Jesus' hands. The reason Jesus came into the world was to express to us in the most ultimate way God's love for us. Lead like Jesus is to lead with our hands. And then in Lead Like Jesus, they point out 1/4 quality, and that is to be aware of your habits. The repetitious things that we do in our life help to lead us. That Jesus showed up in worship to worship God. I'm so glad you're here this morning. It's a busy time of the year, but you've taken this time to be here to orient yourself toward Jesus. Jesus' prayer life, even though his life was busy, he made that time to set aside and to be with God. In this season that is so busy. It's hard, but it's necessary, as that call to worship kind of reminded us to slow down and just spend a little more time in that preparation for the time of Jesus. As you lead, wherever you lead, if you're a leader in your house, and you probably have some leadership there, in your workplaces, in your volunteer activities, in your life here at church, as we prepare for Jesus, be thinking about his leadership and how we can lead more like Jesus. Amen.